Right, so Dick, thank you very much for taking the time to connect with us on Adventure Lifestyle. You're a very busy person. Adventure Lifestyle, as I just talked about, is all about helping people live more adventurous lives, but we're going to be a little bit playful with this interview, and we're going to start off on a slightly different kilter to what we normally do. We've got Sam Gash with us today, who's also going to help me out, and Sam, you've got a couple of questions that you're going to ask first before we get into the more adventure-specific stuff.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Dick, you are very well known in the media for kind of speaking your mind and being quite blunt and direct about it, which I personally love. So I thought I just wanted to kind of ask some really broad questions, some policy more questions, and you can answer it in like one word, a sentence, or no longer than a paragraph.
Wonderful.
But the first question is about Australia becoming a republic.
Don't really care. To me, it's boring. The system works okay now, but I don't mind if it became a republic, as long as it's not going to cost anything. There's so many more important things we should be looking at than becoming a republic. So that's my answer there.
Perfect.
A GST increase.
GST increase, I think it's going to happen, but it's going to be difficult for poorer people, and I'm very concerned what's happening in Australia and it's like the rest of the world, the wealthy are getting wealthier and the poor poorer, and I think that worries me. I'd be quite happy for the wealthy to pay more tax. Unfortunately, it's not supported by that many more wealthy people, but the best way is income tax, but people are obsessed with not paying income tax, but we're so stupid we'll actually pay GST and taxes like that because they tend to be hidden. Even though it might appear on your bill, it's a lot more hidden than actually paying income tax. And so that's why politicians realise, look, we have to raise taxes to pay for all the fantastic things we have, like education and schooling and the police force, defence. But people are so stupid that we have to hide the taxes, and so putting it in as a GST tends to hide it, whereas putting it on as income tax is very obvious and people object to it.
Great. Australia's immigration policy, and specifically in relation to our offshore processing centres like Nauru.
Right. Well, first of all, I'm very keen on stabilising our population. In fact, the whole world has to stabilise its population. The problem we've got at the moment is that we use about 1.5 times the world's resources every year, just in living, with 7 billion people. And of course, 2 billion are nearly starving. So if ever you gave the 7 billion a reasonably standard of living, where they could be warm, they could be well fed, you'd be using 2 or 3 times the Earth's resources every year. So the whole thing is not sustainable. So we need to get, first of all, a major reduction in world population. And that's a very easy thing to do. All you've got to do is educate women. Once women are educated, they have smaller families. I'm not into coercion, I'm not into population control, but the best example in the world is Japan, where Japan has a $20,000 baby bonus. They'll pay a Japanese woman $20,000 if she has a baby. But Japanese women are sensible. They realise it's a tiny country for 120 million people, and at the present time the population is going to end up at about 90 million. So that's talking about the world. We actually have too many people in the world. When it comes to immigration, first of all borders are unfair. They are immoral. But I'm not planning to change that, because I and my family and my children and grandchildren benefit from having borders, as all countries do, because it allows us to keep a way of life and to make changes slowly. Human beings are not good at making changes quickly. And so I'm not planning to change borders. Also, for an advantage for Australia, a wealthy country, even the poorest countries have borders. If I went to go to Bangladesh without a passport or a visa, I wouldn't be able to go there. I'd be locked up and deported. So that seems to be the world. So having said that, borders are unfair. They're here, and borders are here for self-interest. And I think we've got to be honest about that. All the rubbish and lies politicians go on about, where they say we're against people smugglers and we're against people drowning at sea. No, they're not. They're against losing control of our borders and making our country change too quickly, because they know it's going to give instability. It's going to give instability. And when you consider the number of people who would like to come to Australia if they could, if there was an open border, would be millions, probably tens of millions, which would so drastically change our standard of living. It would destroy the country that we know it today, at least for the next few generations, and that's why we don't want to change that. So generally speaking, I support the present system where countries have borders and you only get here if you're wealthy. You can immigrate if you're wealthy, or if you're offering something to our country that we need. Very selfish, but it's life, and every country does the same thing.
Brilliant. Now, it's...
I would interrupt. A couple of years ago, you put forward an initiative for an individual under the age of 30, $100 million if they're able to, become famous or well known for a sensible plan on sustainable population.
Yep.
How has that search gone?
Well, it's been a complete failure. Now it's interesting. It's not $100 million. It's $1 million.
I meant $1 million.
But it's an enormous amount of money. It's still available. I've got the money sitting there in the bank,
really?
And I want to give it to one person out of the 7 billion people on this earth. I want one person, one young person under 30, to come up and say, "You, Dick Smith, and people of your generation have wrecked this world. You are ruining this world because you know that a system that requires perpetual growth is impossible. And our whole economic system we have requires perpetual growth, otherwise it will collapse. And the perpetual growth, if it was growth in efficiencies and quality of life, it would be okay. But the perpetual growth we require is in digging out stuff from the ground. It's in population increase the whole time. It's in consumerism. The reason we require this perpetual growth is our economic system is a type of Ponzi scheme. In other words, it's completely unstable, and it requires, for Australia's example, huge numbers of extra immigrants, about 250,000 a year, to get new taxpayers to pay for our old age of people now. The problem with that is that when those new taxpayers, that huge bubble of 250,000 per year, get older, you then need 500,000 more. So the whole thing just becomes completely unstable and impossible to run. So what I want is one young person who becomes famous in communicating that you have to live in balance, and that we can do that, we can have a fantastic world, but it doesn't have perpetual population growth. It doesn't have Peter Costello was talking about 3% growth per year. That means you're doubling, whatever you're growing, you're doubling every 25 years. It's impossible. And so we have a situation in Sydney where I live, and I used to have when I was a kid, a house with a backyard and with a cubby house. They're now knocking down those beautiful Federation homes and putting high-rise. And don't worry, the high-rises are only 6 stories now. They'll be knocked down and we'll have 60-story high-rise, and it will end up like Shanghai, because of our utter stupidity. And I can't work out why there isn't one young person who becomes famous in saying, you older people know that this is a con, it's unstable, it's impossible, and you should be telling the truth.
Have you had anyone come forward?
No, the closest I've had is Bindi Irwin.
I read about that.
Yeah, Bindi Irwin has made statements which are fantastic. She's doubted population growth. Mm-hmm. She actually wrote an article for the American Hillary Clinton. She was asked to do an article, and she talked about the fact that population growth can't go on forever, and all that was edited out of her article.
Okay, by the editor.
By the editor who was working for Hillary Clinton, because the fundamentalist Christian movement in the United States doesn't want to doubt growth. And many of them believe that you can just have growth forever because they've never stopped and thought properly. And the best example of how to live in balance is the Aboriginal people of this country. They never had more in up to 60,000 years. They never had more than 1 million people here because they knew that you had to live in balance. And it's interesting, at the present time we have 23 million, 24 million. The rate we're going, we'll have 100 million by the end of this century, and in the time of modern European Australia, 220 years, we will have 1 billion people. Now that is so stupid. Is it possible? Of course it's possible. We can use every bit of uranium to desalinate water, to grow food in factories and to have everyone living in 100-story buildings. But it's complete madness because the only people who benefit are the wealthy. because they have more customers. Everyone else is to have 100 million people in Australia compared to 20 million. Everyone's going to be worth 20% as much. You're worth a fifth as much. So the growth has to be contained, and I'm just amazed that there's not one young person who doesn't communicate this. And blame people like me. I've benefited from growth, not that I thought about it at the time. I'm making a fortune for myself.
Well, you hear it right now.
Hopefully there's someone listening who
$1
might
million
take up the challenge.
still out there for someone to step
Wouldn't that
up.
be wonderful if there's someone listening, wow, just become famous. When I was a kid, there was a chap
Just
called...
become famous.
When I was a kid,
Australia's Got Talent? Do you
there was a
think they'll
chap
take
called
some?
Paul Ehrlich. He's famous. Look him up in the... he wrote the population bomb or something like that, and he predicted the whole world would collapse by now. Now, he was wrong because he'd underestimated our ability to design new fertilisers and to do the most incredible things, which were ingenious creatures. But the very fact he was world famous with his predictions, and he was a university professor without any money, we need a new Paul Ehrlich who says the problem is worse than it's ever been, and how can you be so stupid to think you can live beyond nature. Nature lives in balance. Go out and look at those beautiful Major Mitchell cockatoos, or go to Cooper's Creek and look at the corellas there. The number of corellas depends on the number of river red gums and the number of hollows to breed. It's in wonderful balance. Do they grow exponentially? No. So that's what we should be doing, living in balance.
Yeah, there's some lessons to be taken from nature on that.
Absolutely.
And let's get into some more adventure stuff. Tell us about the story. Tell us the story of a photo you took of a young Indian girl under a bridge while you were with Kip over in India, and then what Chris Bray and Jess Bray ended up doing.
Well, first of all, adventure. Adventure is my drug. See, I don't drink. I've never liked alcohol. I don't drink. I've never taken drugs because my drug is adventure. It's the adrenaline pumping excitement of taking risk. But I call it responsible risk-taking. I've done 5 flights around the world, a number of them very risky single-engine aircraft over 20,000 kilometres of ocean.
Yeah.
And I knew if I had an engine failure, all very well, I'm going to be floating around in my life jacket. Very small chance.
A great chance.
That's right. But so what I did was I managed the risk. I call it responsible risk-taking, and I remember thinking, if I'm going to fly around the world, what's the safest helicopter in the world? It was the Bell Jet Ranger. I did all the figures, and so I bought a Bell Jet Ranger and flew in the safest helicopter. All of my risk-taking is what I call responsible risk-taking, but it is done because of the incredible adrenaline-pumping excitement. For me to head off over a wild ocean, and in those days it was before GPS, when I flew around the world I couldn't get into Russia because of the Cold War, so I had to land on a ship between Japan and Alaska. And to find that ship, the ship ran into fog. In the end, I eventually found the ship, landed on it, first ever landing, rolling around to refuel, because you can't get across the Pacific Ocean in a helicopter. It doesn't have enough range.
Yeah.
And you couldn't land in Russia, so you...
I'd be shot down if I went to Russia.
Yep.
And so here was the adrenaline pumping excitement. So what I say to young people is, try and have that spirit of adventure. The adults of the world today are trying to knock it out of everyone. You can't climb on the Three Sisters, you can't do this, you can't do that. There's all these rules and regulations. Well, break them. Just go and have an adventure and make sure you've responsibly organised what you're doing. Occasionally things will go wrong, but that's far better than getting onto drugs or heading off to run with ISIS and all terrible things like that.
It's it's interesting you say this. You're a man after my own heart. I'm a lawyer, so I'm trained to be risk adverse, but I left the law for this very adventurous endurance pursuit, and this year I'm running across India, from Jaisalmer all the way to Shillong. And the first thing I get asked, a lot by people who are Indians but now live abroad, is all about the risks. It's the first question that they ever bring up to me. And like you, I say that so you say you're a responsible risk taker, and I say I'm a risk-adverse risk taker.
Same thing.
Exactly the same. And obviously I prepare for all those risk mitigation tools along the way, and I do as much as I can. But I know that some things will get out of my control, and I have to be adaptable. But I definitely believe people do try and quash down. I'm not that young. I'm 31, but people try and quash down very idealistic, adventurous pursuits without constraints of safety on society. So I'm really impressed by kind of your attitude for that and kind of putting that call out to young people to follow.
Well, that's what we should be doing. Now, you asked about Divya, the little girl under the railway bridge, and that more and more goes on to my interest in philanthropy, because as a kid I was in a group called the Boy Scouts, and we learned to do a good turn to someone every day to help other people at all times. My parents didn't have any money.
What was that philosophy that you, part of the Scouts, do a good turn to everyone?
As a cub, you, as part of the cub promise, was to do a good turn to someone every day. And Baden Powell, he formed the Scout movement, and then in the Scout promise, if I remember correctly, it was to help other people at all times, part of these promises that you had. And so it was ingrained in me, and I just, that was part of my life. And my parents had no money, but they were always volunteering. And so that was just ingrained in me, that that's what I should do. And when it comes to little Divya, the little girl...
Flash forward to India.
Yeah,
you're on a train, are you?
Last year I was on a very exclusive train called the Marirajas Express. And as trains do as they cross India or cross anywhere, they stop all the time for various indeterminate reasons, sitting there while we stopped. And
Indian Pacific 30 years ago, eh?
Yeah, but it's the same as anything. Trains stop everywhere, which is interesting. And I'm sitting in my little cabin. My wife happened to be in the restaurant, and I'm level. We've stopped under a railway bridge, and there is a couple of Indian families living under that railway bridge, including a little 8-year-old girl who was completely naked. She was running around helping her two brothers by the look of it, and they were playing with water in a bucket. At the time I thought this poor family, there was a goat. I thought at least they owned a goat. In fact, we found out later they were so poor that wasn't their goat. And this little girl we found out later, had been born under the railway bridge. The parents had been there for 12 years. And I decided at the time that I would try and help that family to move away from the railway bridge.
So you decided in that very moment?
Yeah, that very moment. So I quickly took photographs with my iPhone.
Yeah.
Then I quickly went to Google Maps and stored the map position where we were under the railway bridge.
We were wondering that very thing.
We're reliving the moment.
I can show you to it on the phone. And so then got back home and thought, well, I've got to get someone to go back there. I couldn't go back, and so I rang Chris and Jess Bray and said, who can you recommend? And they said, we'll go.
Now, let's just pause there for a minute. I'm a little bit annoyed at this as well, because we actually had Chris Bray locked in for an interview.
Right.
But he had this emergency trip to India,
well, there you
which
are.
He cancelled on us. So
that's what it was about. So he went off, I gave them the airfare, and I said, you've got to go to this railway bridge and find this little girl, and we're going to help her. We're going to give her a worthwhile life with her family. Now, it's not as easy as that, because first of all, they got to the railway bridge and they couldn't speak the language, and everyone was very suspicious of them.
Yeah.
And initially the people under the railway bridge denied that this little girl even lived there. They showed the photographs.
Yeah.
But eventually Chris and Jess went off and they found a university professor. And they came back with a university professor who spoke the language, and he explained that these people from Australia had taken these photographs and wanted to give the photographs to the family. And so eventually the little girl appears, and the photos show that she's absolutely terrified, because there's these two white people from Australia. There's a university professor, and they're asking for this little girl, and there's this extraordinary shot of her cringing, holding onto her mother and looking around the side of her mother with a terrified look on her face, that she thinks she's done something terribly wrong, that these officials could come to talk and see her. Finally it was communicated, no, you've done nothing wrong, we want to help you. And since then we've now got her into a good school. We are still trying to help the family get into better accommodation. That's very difficult, because in fact we're pretty sure the father wants to stay under the railway bridge. That's where he's lived, and so it's a lot harder. I knew it would be difficult, and over the years I've attempted to do similar things and I've always failed. I tried to help a couple in Kathmandu, and in the end we lost contact. It was just not possible. So it's not as easy as you think. I've had lots of people write to me, say, Dick, can we put some money in and do it with other people? And I've said, well, you don't know how difficult it is. So we've at least got little Divya at school. We haven't got the family into proper accommodation yet. and that's what we're working on. And it might work and it might not work. We'll see what happens in the next month or so.
Yeah.
Bridges Out of Poverty. It's a book that I read, and I think it would serve you well to have a flick through it. It's got some really good concepts.
Now let me explain to you. My philanthropy is first of all, I have two charitable foundations. One is the Dick Smith Foods Foundation, which we've given about $7 million away. But we have a family foundation, and that's mainly doing major financing. We've built a school in Afghanistan. We've half funded a hospital in Somalia. So in other words, we're doing major projects, and that's where most of our money goes. Over the years, I think we've donated about $7 million to the Salvation Army, where they have all the skilled social workers for assisting people. So this type of minor thing is quite small. It's very time consuming, and
It's more time consuming.
and it's very difficult to succeed. And I went into this with eyes opened, and whether we'll be able to help this little girl and this family, time will tell. It's very, very difficult to do that. Let me explain a little bit about philanthropy. I personally do it for selfish reasons, and that is it makes me feel good, right? So I'm totally selfishly motivated. People say, oh, but it's altruistic selfishness. And I said, no, it's not. It's just selfishness. I said, if I had more pleasure in buying a waterfront at Point Piper with my money, I would do so. That would not make me feel good, but helping other people makes me feel good. So it's totally self-motivated, so I don't kid myself with anything else. No, I don't have Dick Smith Cancer Centres. I don't put my name on it because that would take away from the pleasure. I don't do it secretly because I'm trying to motivate other wealthy people into giving, but I don't do it to have my name on it because that will take away from the pleasure of saying I'm doing something worthwhile for other people.
It's a balance.
Yeah, it's a balance. And also I look on it as an obligation. I think if you're wealthy in a country like Australia, we love to think it's because of our own natural brilliance of making money, but in fact it isn't. It's because we have this incredible community here of 23 million people, and a very stable society where I've been able to do well. And so that's why I believe, as well as wealthy people should pay their tax, they should also be public philanthropists and make it obvious that they are fulfilling an obligation to help others.
What do you consider wealthy? What do you consider wealthy?
Anyone over $100 million of net worth is incredibly wealthy. You could never, once you've got $100 million, you could never ever spend it all in your lifetime. And I have friends who are worth $400 or $500 million and don't give anything to charity, but they've got chips on their shoulders and they're unhappy. I'm trying to get Rupert Murdoch, who's worth $7 billion, to come back and set up Australia's first $1 billion charity. I haven't had any luck as yet, but that's what I'd like to do. His mother, Dame Elizabeth Murdoch, was one of my greatest motivators, and she is just a wonderful philanthropist. So I want him to do what she was doing. We've got people like Bill Gates, who people could say, what a selfish person to be worth all that money, but once he announced he was going to give it all away, you think, what a fantastic person. And that's true, he is fantastic. And so we need that ethos to be in Australia. At the present time, we don't have that. In America, if you're wealthy, you're obligated and you're a social pariah if you're not known as a philanthropist. In Australia, you're actually encouraged to keep your giving secret. And with the Business Review weekly rich list, which lists all the billionaires, I've tried to get them to list under the names what they do with philanthropy. They won't list that because they said, oh, people might stop buying our magazine. The wealthy won't want to be outed.
And didn't you one year end up donating $4 million to the Salvation Army to avoid being on that list?
Well, yeah, that's a bit embarrassing, but yes, they were going to put me on the list.
In the papers.
They were going to put me on the list, the rich list, and I didn't want to be on it. And I said, so what's the limit? And whatever it was, I worked out if I donated $4 million, I'd be under it. So I donated $4 million, and I wasn't on the list.
And now I've just told it anyway. But I agree very much with that distinction between Australia and the United States. And I wonder what you think it is about the Australian ethos and culture that makes those who are wealthy not want to give.
It's interesting. When I was a kid in the 1950s, the wealthy were givers. They were all philanthropists. We had a person called Sir Edward Holstrom who designed the Silent Night refrigerator that ran off kerosene, I think, for country people. And he was a multi-millionaire in pounds in those days, and he was a philanthropist. And Macpherson McRobertson and McRobertson's Chocolates. So all of those business people were philanthropists. Then we got into the new age of quick money and everything, and that went. Now, I don't know why. It's beyond comprehension to me to hear that a bank manager should earn $16 million a year, which is outrageously disgusting, because the bank manager didn't start the bank, didn't take any risk, and we all know if the bank gets into problem, the taxpayer will have to bail them out. And then these people are not known as philanthropists. And so I've outed them. I've got on television and naming these people and saying, why aren't you known as a philanthropist? Now what they say is, oh, we're different to you, Dick, we do it secretly. Except when I've spoken to the major charities, they never receive large amounts of money secretly or anonymously. It doesn't happen.
No.
So in effect, somehow we've changed where these wealthy people can be unbelievably selfish, and we should out them and we should embarrass them, and I say, go and leave this country, we don't want you here. And it's actually working. I mean, a good example is Kerry Packer was not known as a generous person. He donated the Packer Whackers and things like that in minor giving, but now the Packer family have set up a Packer Foundation and giving large amounts of money away. I think that's fantastic. And we're now getting some of the wealthy doing it more publicly, and I think that's wonderful. I think that's what they should be doing.
Do you want to answer the question that Roger kindly contributed to our...
Yeah, a good friend of mine who lives in Sydney asked this question. He said, how does it feel to 1 week personally contribute to a complete change in the future prospects of someone who's never met you, and then the next have your name associated with a bankruptcy that is nothing to do with you?
Oh, right. Well, first of all, 1 week, yes, to be associated with the little girl and helping her. I didn't know there'd be any publicity on that at all, but what happened is Chris and Jess put it on the internet, which I'm not even on the Facebook or something, and it went viral and everyone knows about it. Dick Smith Electronics. Just to explain, I started Dick Smith Electronics with $610 with my fiancée, now my wife, 47 years ago. First of all, I sold it after about 10 years, so I sold it over 30 years ago, because I didn't like a company that was too big where I didn't know everyone. It got to about 500 staff, and I sold it. Now, I'm immensely proud that it stayed and employed Aussies for 47 years. I think that's just absolutely fantastic. I'm really disappointed that it's gone broke at the moment. Now, hopefully it's going to be saved. I'm hoping it's going to be saved. But people have then said, oh, do you regret lending your name to it? No, I don't, because for 47 years it's been Australian owned, creating wealth. It was owned by Woolworths, which lots of mum and dads have shares in it. I've never had shares in Woolworths or Dick Smith Electronics since it's been sold, but all of these people have got income for their pensions and to help them that way, and it's lasted for such an enormous amount of time. And having the Dick Smith name on it meant that when I separately assisted people and so forth, the business got the publicity, and that kept people employed. And it's still Australian owned, even if it is in receivership at the moment. And I think when I look back, let's say it does, the worst of the worst happens and it closes down, to think that I started something with $610 that employed people for 47 years is not bad.
Yeah.
But I'd love it to last a bit longer. Also, I have this belief, and I've got 2 daughters, and when they were growing up, I was very wealthy, and still am, and I said, look, every advantage has an equivalent disadvantage. And I said, so when the disadvantages come, welcome them, because especially if they're not too bad. So to me, doing incredibly well out of Dick Smith Electronics, which started my fortune, to after 47 years to have the disadvantage of the company getting all this publicity that it's in economic problems, gee, that's not such a bad disadvantage. I explain to most people, and most people know I haven't been involved for 30 years, and I want it to be saved. And I say to people, look, go and buy something there, because it would be good if that company is saved, because it's Aussie owned and it can employ people. So good, you take the good with the bad.
I like how you were able to link out the good that the retailer did for every Australian throughout its time of existence, just through the shareholders employing Australians, and it's something that I hadn't really thought of on that level. And the other thing that you briefly touched on was, take the disadvantage, and turning adversity into the advantage is something that we talked about a lot on your podcast, Samantha, but it seems to be a very common theme between a lot of people that I'm talking to. They take the disadvantages and find the silver lining in it and the lessons. And
See, what you've got to understand is I never thought I was going to be successful. I was hopeless at school. I had a speech defect. People would say I was bullied. They used to laugh because I couldn't say S, so I called myself Dick Myth and Dick Fish. And I remember being hauled up in front of the class, and the teacher sending me to the headmistress because she think I was being smart, and the principal rang my mother and she said, well, he can't say S. And I tried to cover up on that. In my 5th class report I recently got out, and I came 45th out of 47th in the class, 47 kids. I left
what
school.
What did the 2 guys below you end up doing? If you started Dick Smith, those other 2 below you, they must have gone a long way.
Amazing. Now the interesting thing was, so I left school, got a job in a factory, thought I was a failure, and it was only when I started my own business that I did okay. And I consider success, you're successful if you have placed yourself in a position where you have the freedom to do what you want to do. That's success. I have a friend who's a park ranger. He's more successful than me, even though he's never made any money, because he spent his whole life in the out of doors, which I'd love to do. He's now retired. So that's success, and it's having that freedom. The other thing you touched on before is the fact that I get stopped in the street by people who say, Dick, thanks for saying it how it is. Right at the start of this podcast, you talked about the fact that I can say it how it is. And that's an incredible freedom I have. Because I'm wealthy, I don't care if I get sued. I once asked my solicitor, I said, what's the largest defamation payment that's ever been made? And he told me what it was, and I said, wow, I can afford that, so I can say anything. And believe it or not, I don't want to go around and defame people, but I can say anything. And so my dad went and fought in the Second World War, risked his life for the freedom for me to do that. So I do say things that are risky, but I'm doing that because that is the freedom that was fought for, and most people can't do that. If you've got a job in the public service or any career, you have to watch what you're saying. That I don't have to. I've been able to say what I wanted to say for 40 years, and I've said it. And it really makes me feel good when someone says, Dick, thanks for saying it how it is. We need you, and that's what I'll do. And so if you remember, I was a very good friend of John Howard, who's the Prime Minister. His kids went to school with our kids, but when he locked David Hicks up in Guantanamo Bay without a trial, I was the person who came out, and I was attacked by the media as a supporter of David Hicks, a supporter of terrorism. And I said, no, I'm not a supporter of David Hicks. I'm a supporter of giving the bloke a trial, putting him in front of a jury.
You funded his legal representation.
I did. I funded his legal representation. I would do that with anyone because as far as I'm concerned, many cases, if an Australian's locked up in some other country, you can't do anything about it. But in this case, it was an ally of ours. The British had taken their detainees back to England because they said we're not going to be part of this. The Americans had taken their one detainee to the American system and put through the court system there, but we were going to leave this bloke locked up. And I said, you don't do that. And the wonderful thing about Australia is that initially into this office came hundreds of emails of people I couldn't believe could exist. These right-wing, nasty, bigoted people who attacked me because I should dare support David Hicks, who was the classic scapegoat. But then over a period of time, the emails changed. Because I just kept repeating to the media every time they said, Dick Smith is a supporter of David Hicks, I said, no, I don't know David Hicks. I'm a supporter of giving a person a trial, putting them in front of a jury.
Giving them a fair go.
Giving them a fair go. Anyone a fair go. That's the Australian way. Eventually, all the emails changed. And they came into, good on you, this is fantastic, and so forth. And as it was, David Hicks finally got back, and he was never a supporter of terrorism, because a supporter of terrorism is an evil person who should be locked up forever, because terrorism is killing innocent people, right? David Hicks was never into that, but he was made a scapegoat by an otherwise good person, John Howard, the Prime Minister, which I wasn't going to allow to happen. And so I'm so glad, even though I took the flack, that I just constantly said, give the bloke a trial. Now, they would never give him a trial because they knew the jury would say, this is crap. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He knew nothing about terrorism against, innocent people. He was actually trying to fight for the freedom of the people in Kashmir, and in the 60s he would have been called a freedom fighter, said. But because of the unfortunate time he was there when Osama bin Laden ran planes into buildings, he was linked to all of that, which of course he knew nothing about.
Did that stance impact your relationship with John Howard?
Interestingly enough, yes, it did in the short term, but I have to admire John Howard because years later, after I'd made a major donation to the Lions movement, he was at a function and he had to get up and give a vote of thanks to Dick Smith, and he was entirely positive.
Yep.
So good on him, he's a statesman.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
You've been really successful and really outspoken, and you've managed to make some massive change across aviation and other areas of Australia. Generally, people who are so outspoken, I've found, struggle to be successful in my non-for-profit background and that kind of stuff. You really have to, as you said earlier, pick your words, be very political to get to a position where you can affect change. How have you managed to be so outspoken, continue to be so outspoken?
Because I'm financially independent. See, all of these people you're talking about, and I agree, if you're a head of a charitable foundation, you mustn't offend the big companies because, wow, they won't donate to you. And you've got a career path and you want to get you in the public service or anything. You're in the Scout movement, you'd like to do better. And so you've got this limitation. I've never had that. See, I've been completely independent, and even when I was chairman of the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, I just said it as it was.
Yeah.
I was chairman of the Centenary Federation Council, and I was one of the first people who said we should change the Australia Day and call it First Fleet Day, and we should work a neutral date that all Australians, including the original Aboriginal Australians, can celebrate.
Yeah.
And have I had flack about that? Oh, a little bit of flack, but I don't care, because to me, the conceit of the British who came here saying it's terra nullius, there's nobody here. There was this incredible culture that had been here for tens of thousands of years that did something that we're not doing. It lived in balance, right? And so to me, to be that arrogant to say no one was here, and the day we're going to celebrate 200 years later when we've realised that is still the day when we, European man, came here, that's just so conceited and so wrong that one thing I'm going to do is make sure that day is changed.
So what day do you think Australia Day could be on?
I've got no idea, but you just pick a date.
It doesn't have to change into something that's excluding.
Yeah, to me, I would pick a date that changes, so it's a Friday or a Monday, so we can have a permanent long weekend, because that's great for Aussies, we'd love to celebrate it. Look, it's interesting, someone did a sign and they called it Dickhead Day, and there's these complaints. I thought it was fantastic, because that's fun. You can't be too politically correct. There are a lot of dickheads on Australia Day. Good, they have barbecues and drink too much and all the rest of it. I'm not a nationalist, but I'm a patriot, and I call a patriot as someone, when I go to the Olympic Games, not that I've ever been to them, but if I did, I would barrack for Australia, for the fun of it. I never take it seriously. And so to me, that's a patriot. A nationalist is someone like Hitler who thought they were superior. I've never been into that.
Yeah.
I never say, many Aussies say we're the best country in the world. I've never said that. We're a very fortunate country, because most people believe their country's the best, but we're a very fortunate country. The fact that we have a high standard of living, and someone as hopeless as me, who could never pass an exam at school, can do okay and be at 71 years of age of reasonable health and be able to say it how it is and not end up in jail. Here's another thing. I've never ever thought I had to bribe someone in my whole business career in this country. I've never bribed anyone, but I've never even been in a position where I've thought, that bloke's hinting to take some money. It's never happened. Now, I think that's a fantastic thing about a country, that you can run 3 completely separate businesses, Dick Smith Electronics, Australian Geographic Magazine and Dick Smith Foods, and all the things, the buildings we've had to put up and the approvals we've had to get and all the rest of it, and never had someone saying, here's some money. So that's a wonderful thing about this country. And I'm not saying it's corruption free, but it is pretty corruption free compared to many countries.
I just want to talk about, you said the financial freedom has enabled you to still be successful, and I've got a saying which none of my employees like when I am employed, and I say I'm willing to get fired to do the job properly. So
That's a wonderful thing.
I think
and good on you, because see, many people are so desperate to have this career and move up, they're not going to say that.
Yeah, and it gets harder with the family to still maintain that hard line, I'm going to do the right thing regardless of what it is.
But you feel good inside, and I know lots of bureaucrats, and they've said to me, oh Dick, do what you say is really right. I know some senior people at Woolworths who, when I came out and said this whole madness of the growth thing, where the Woolworths executives have to push every farmer down, and Woolworths now run more poker machines than anybody, they said to me, we don't like it, but it's being pushed on us by us. All the shareholders and the mums and dads superannuation funds are saying, why aren't Woolworths shares going up in value all the time? Sack the board, sack the chief executive. And that's how mad capitalism has become. Because you can't as you get to the limits of growth, you have to be on the verge of dishonesty to get the growth, and that's what's happening at the moment.
Dick, you've been on many great adventures. How do you choose them, or do they choose you?
I choose them. My riskiest adventure I've ever been on is probably the 2 balloon flights from across Australia.
And across the ditch.
And also across from New Zealand to Australia, because you're completely out of control. And a balloon, I just got my balloon licence, I'm quite an inexperienced balloon pilot, but I did notice that all the ballooning companies, they fly early in the morning or late in the evening when there's no wind. And the minute they see the wind coming up more than about 10 knots, they land. Whereas if you're going to fly across a country or across an ocean, you have no idea what's going to happen at the landing. So that means that you take off. We flew across Australia at 160 kilometres an hour in the jet stream. This balloon is screaming along, unbelievable, but you're sitting there, there's not a breath of wind because you're in the wind. So it just sits there, gradually rotating, looking at the most wonderful scenery. But there in your stomach the whole time is, we've got to land this thing. It weighs 3 tonnes. And what's going to happen when we get to the end? Is it going to be a 30-knot wind, and are we going to be killed? Smashed into something, into power lines, into a mountain. Luckily, both times I've been able to land, I've been a very lucky person in relatively low winds, right? So that was, the balloon flights are risky. The single-engine helicopter flight around the world, very risky. Times I thought, if I can finish this leg and get into a port and land in the helicopter, I'm going to pack the helicopter up into a shipping container and ship it home and come up with some fantastic excuse about how I couldn't complete it. The human psyche being as it is, even though I was scared, I remember halfway across the Atlantic between Greenland and Iceland, I was in terrible weather, and I knew that if the engine had failed, if I came down, the ocean had a 40-knot gale on it with bits of icebergs being blown off, and I was going to last about 2 minutes before I die of exposure sort of thing. But when I got into Reykjavik, I went and had a cup of coffee and that, and then I thought, oh, it wasn't too bad, maybe I'll just go to London. And in fact, my whole flight around the world was like that, being absolutely scared, but then thinking maybe it wasn't too bad, maybe I should just do the next leg. And that's what makes it exciting. See, knowing that I was right on the edge. Solo adventuring is the most difficult, because once you've got someone beside you, you've got 2 people who can discuss things and that. One bit of my film I made on the solo flight around the world, the editor said, oh look, I'm really sorry, the audio is faulty. And I said, what do you mean the audio's faulty? He said, oh, you listen to it, it's got a sort of a tremor on it. When I listened, it was my voice being so frightened.
Wow.
And it was a tremor on my voice because I was bloody scared. I explained that to him. He said, wow, yes, that is, you're right, you're scared. And so we left it in the film sort of thing. And remember, in those days, it was before GPS and before satellite phones or anything. So half the time I didn't know where I was. And, finding a ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, I built up a non-directional beacon. I still own Dick Smith Electronics. I bought some components. Friend had built up this little box.
Wholesale or retail?
wholesale price. And we built up a little box, and we had an area which we dangled over the crane on the ship, or this friend of mine who I put on the ship.
Yeah.
And 3 days after he'd left Yokohama, and the ship's halfway across the Pacific, he's calling me on the radio saying, I've turned on the beacon and I'm getting no reading as I'm heading towards them. Eventually, when I got close enough, I got a bit of a reading, and I was able to home in on the ship, because finding a ship in those days, it was difficult.
What was the exit strategy if the beacon wasn't going to work? When you're sitting there, you're flying, and you're thinking, this is not working.
The exit strategy nearly happened, and that was the ship ran into fog. And so I called up a high-flying airline and I said, can you tell the authorities I'm going to head to Russia? Because I could see the Kamchatka Peninsula, and I could see these volcanoes sticking out of the cloud. Now, I'd been told I would be shot down. I believed I wouldn't be, but my plan was to go and land on one of the volcanoes up on the rim. Amazingly enough, 3 months later, almost to the day, there was an infamous shoot down where a beautiful Korean 007 747 jumbo jet was shot down by the Russians in exactly the same area.
Wow.
And it got lost. It was going from Alaska to Korea, and it got off track into the Kamchatka Peninsula, and they just set up a fighter and shot this plane with 300 people in it down. Luckily, my helicopter was so tiny, I don't think they ever detected that I was there, because I had to fly the first few hours through their Russian restricted zone, and I think I did that without anyone realising I was there.
I mean, I've just got two things that come straight. The greatest success of an adventure is when failure is so imminent.
Yep.
Do you feel that?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, the harder they are, the more exciting they are, without any doubt. And being frightened. I mean, being frightened is, it's amazing. People have said to me, oh, of course, you must have this incredible guts, and, you're not frightened. I said, you've got to be joking.
Yeah.
Am I frightened? But for some reason, I've got this drive. And even now, I'll fly up the coast in my helicopter, and I'm tempted to turn right out across the ocean, because it's the drug that I've got.
Yeah.
That, wow, if I head right across the ocean, would I get to Lord Howe Island? Will there be an engine failure in the way? Maybe there won't be, or maybe I'll get there.
Well, I've heard you've got the range on the Jet Ranger, don't you, to get to Lord Howe?
Yeah, I've got a big extra tank for the Jet Ranger, but I've also got another helicopter, an Augusta. It's an Italian one. It'll go directly to Lord Howe with the standard tank. I'm very spoiled with my toys.
Oh, yeah, your toys are amazing. Mine are a pair of runners. And I have to ask, how do you reconcile that immense risk that you're telling me right now that you've taken, and the fact that you have a wife and 2 daughters?
Yeah, it's selfishness. Yeah, look, I must admit, my favourite photograph is of my wife and our 2 daughters. They must have been 10 and 12 at the time. At the Sydney helipad when I left for the last stage of my flight around the world, solo flight. And I look now and I think, how could I be that irresponsible, that stupid, to leave this wonderful family, a loving wife and 2 beautiful daughters, and take this completely unnecessary risk. It wasn't necessary, but I have to do things like that. And I'm amazed, first of all, that my wife supported me. Admittedly, she said, she thought I'd get it out of my system. She didn't realise I ended up doing 5 flights around the world, not just one.
You pushed those boundaries there.
I pushed those boundaries. But no, it's selfishness, and if my wife suddenly said, I want to go and do something like that, wow, I'd be against it. Because I'd think, God, I'm going to be sitting at home worrying every bit of the way. So, yeah, it's selfishness.
Bear Grylls has had a very similar, he had a bit of an aha moment where he's like, I can't keep taking the level of risk that I have with my family.
Right.
And so I think he kind of, I don't know if he truly kind of dumbed down the sense of adventure that he's gone on since then, but I think
he's of course a religious person, isn't he?
Yes, he's very much so.
I'm not at all, so I'm agnostic about agnosticism. So I was fortunate. I went around the world when I was 20 years of age and saw the most incredible religions, and realised that if I pick the Christian religion, which is the most likely one I'd pick because I was born here, that I'd have to say, in effect, all the others were wrong because of so many conflictions, and I just couldn't do that. So I'm not religious, but I'm not an atheist. My attitude is, well, maybe, but how do you pick the right one? So if I was born in Saudi Arabia, no doubt I'd be Muslim.
Yeah.
And it doesn't sound logical to me that depending on where you just happen to be born depends on what religion you have.
Yeah, and
So
it
I
can't
don't
be
quite-
just a right one, and if you go to the wrong one, well then you condemn.
But yeah, you condemn.
Surely it doesn't work that way.
Doesn't sound logical. And my thing is, if you do the right thing, surely if there is a God, he or she is going to do the right thing.
Now
That's all
imagine,
I can work out.
imagine how much easier your helicopter flights would have been if you had some Dick Smith peanut butter to fuel you as you're going across the
Yeah,
ditch. You
well,
could
in
have
those,
some
in
really
those
good
days I
foods.
didn't have Dick Smith foods, but when I flew the Tasman
Yeah.
against the wind, the wrong way we called it,
In the
I
balloon.
took in the balloon.
Yeah.
I took some Dick Smith Aussie mate, and we told everyone it was powered. And I
Is that the
remember-
jar behind us there?
Yeah, that was probably the jar. It might have been Aussie Mate. By the way, if you notice all the other brands, we've got Dickie Mite and Mighty Dick because we had a
Mighty
court action at the moment where a bloke down in Adelaide, in effect, pinched our name, and he, instead of OZE, he brought out a yeast spread called AUSSIE, Aussie Mite, and then
I'm confused.
he did that, but then when we finally got our product out, which took years, he then took us to the trademarks office and has tried to get our name struck off, even though I came up with it first.
Oh, that's-
So we've spent this fortune in court and we're just waiting for the result of the hearing, and we're hoping we can keep our Aussie Mite name. We said he can keep his name and the public will decide which one
Which
they
one they want
want
to
to buy.
have.
That's
Yeah,
right.
let the
them
consumer
know.
decide.
Exactly right.
I'll be too confused when I get to the checkout. I'll be seeing all of them next to each other and I'll go,
Oh no,
I'll just get peanut butter.
mine says Dick Smith's Aussie Mite, OZE, and his says Roger Ramsey's Aussie Mite, AUSSIE. So it's pretty obvious they're completely
The
different.
important question though, does all the money from his products go to charities?
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, well there's the difference.
Yeah, there's the difference. And I think he'd be having enough problems just in keeping his head above water because he's a little Aussie businessman, which I admire. But I don't think his product was originally called Dinky Dynamite, which was a wonderful name.
Yeah.
But he decided to change it. When I got all the immense publicity, he decided, because we hadn't got the product out, to in effect pinch our name. And that's what the court case is all about. Now we're hoping we'll get a win, but the courts is quite strange, and there was a period for 3 years when we didn't sell a product because we were working on getting the design right. I got lots of publicity on Aussie Mite, but we didn't sell the product, and that's what he's going on, the fact that we didn't sell it for 3 years. So on a technicality he could win, and that's going to be a disaster for Dick Smith Foods.
do we have a backup name?
Oh yeah, we've got Mighty Dick. But no one likes, my
Let's
wife
hope it
doesn't
doesn't
like.
get to that.
Yeah,
Let's hope the courts see
we've
common
got,
sense.
we've got Dickie Mite up there, but I like Mighty Dick.
And the wife isn't
No. Most of my friends are not so keen on Mighty Dick. You can see Mighty Dick there on the shelf, and it's on the left, the one on the left. I think that'd be a great one.
I'm sure you'll get some good social media
Because
traction
I've
for
had
that one.
dickhead matches.
Yeah, we talked
Yeah,
about
we-
that as we walked in here.
Yeah, dickhead matches. So what's wrong with Mighty Dick?
Oh, I must admit, I digress, but Sam told me about Dick Doves, and I was just doing some research, and I was in a caravan park on the Douglas Daly River, and this school bus had just turned up, and all the school kids are streaming off, and I'm on the phone, and I type in Dick Does into Google, and that's probably not something you should do in a public place.
No, probably not. Well, in fact,
We learned.
that was the Dick Smith Electronics. I didn't know who came up with that, but I had the iceberg that I towed into Sydney Harbour, and they jumped the double-decker bus over 17 motorbikes when Evel Knievel was doing the opposite. He was jumping a motorbike over double-decker buses, so I reversed it. And in all of those things I did to create publicity for Dick Smith Electronics because I didn't have any money. When you start with $610, you have to get free publicity.
So I love this because, I like to use adventure to bring out social change.
Yep.
And here you're using, I suppose, business to bring about, social impact.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and one of my most pleasing things when I was Australian of the Year in 1986, my campaign around Australia was to try and get cigarette advertisements that were directed at young people, young girls especially banned. And I, as part of a group, we succeeded in doing that. Because in those days they'd show this young girl sitting on a park bench with a boyfriend, and it's Peter Jackson, 25, you're laughing, and this gorgeous young girl, and it was completely directed at getting teenage girls to smoke.
Really?
And today you couldn't believe that could be allowed, but it was. And when I campaigned against that, the business community went berserk. Dick, you can't be doing this, you're supposed to be supporting business. And I said, no, not business that's immoral. And now that we know that cigarettes have no safe level of use, we shouldn't be promoting them.
Yeah. Talk to me about the variety bash.
Variety Bash was an idea that I came up with that now has raised over $200 million for charity. And there's an interesting psychology in that, is that the word for it? I had these friends at the time who wouldn't donate any money to charity because they considered they could be called a do-gooder. So I thought, how can I get around that? So I came up with this idea of a car trial where the cars have to be 20 years old, which would stop wealthy people from outdoing each other with more and more expensive cars.
Yeah.
And then I said, look, it's going to raise money for Variety, the charity, but we raise the money by you can bribe and cheat. And so you can bribe the judges and you can cheat by paying, and that money will go to charity.
Oh,
now,
you said there was no bribery in all your career.
Yeah.
You started out.
That's right. I started out in bribery and cheating. Now, the amazing thing was it allowed these business people to be do-gooders without being seen to be as being a do-gooder.
Oh,
because if you're bribing and cheating, and so the first one raised 250 grand, gone on to raise over $200 million with the same principle, because it allows wealthy people and not so wealthy people to show off, inverted commas, but without being looked on as a show off.
Yeah.
And so here they are, they're driving around Australia raising money everywhere, but would you think, oh, these people are do-gooders? No, you wouldn't, because they're cheating and bribing and they have old cars and they're doing the type of thing that reliving their teenage years. And so it was one of the most successful ideas I ever came up with, and I had no idea that one idea could raise such a huge amount of money for charity. And now there's the Royal Flying Doctor Bash, there's bashes all around the world copying the same principle. And someone said, Dick, if you were a good businessman, you would have franchised it with a couple of % and I'd be really wealthy. So there you go. I'm not a good businessman.
Now, before we get into our final questions,
Yep.
what practical advice could you give someone who's thinking about starting out on an adventure? Like you've done ballooning, helicopter, solo flights. For most people, a hike in the snowy mountains seems like a mammoth task that they're not up to. How can you go from a dream, whether it be a hike in the snowies, a daily run, going to the park, whatever, or a helicopter flight around the world? How do you go from dream to action?
Well, I suppose I'd contact Australian Geographic magazine, which is the magazine that I say.
Sam also has done that.
Yeah, and it still supports adventure. And you've got to come up with something that hasn't been done. And whether that's, Tim McCartney stated he was the first person to really climb Everest, because everyone normally flies into Kathmandu and starts from there. He started at Calcutta on the coast and walked the whole way. We sponsored that as Australian Geographic. So you've got to come up with something that's different. I am not so supportive of being the youngest to do something. I have supported Jessica Watson and people like that, but we've got to be careful there, because the age is going to get so young that in the end someone can't do it.
Race to the bottom.
Yeah, and wow, then you're going to be sponsoring someone who went and got killed. But so far it's worked. That Jessica Watson at 16, wasn't she?
Yeah, she finished, I think.
Yeah, could go around the world, and I've flown across Drake Passage and seen the ocean there.
Same.
And this little girl by herself. The only reason I supported her is I rang Don McIntyre and he said, no, Dick, she's going to do it. And I said, what? Because I'm not a sailor.
Yeah.
He said, no, she's one capable lady, and she was. But that's the problem. I've got people who are doing it younger and younger, but there must be things, climbing Kosciuszko from the sea to the summit. I bet no one's done that. There's an idea for you.
You just run a race, didn't you?
There's a race called Coast to Cosy.
And does it go right from the water?
It goes from, the beach in Eden all the way up to...
Well, there you are. How dumb are you?
Every single year. Yeah.
Right. Have you been in it every...
No, I haven't done that race,
Bloody
but
hell.
my partner's done it, and he completed the 240 kilometres in 27 hours.
Oh, how do they do it? Right, well, look, there's all of those things. But the
What
other
about
thing...
everyday people, like the mums and dads at home in Sydney, in North?
Yeah, do something that's going to raise some money for charity. That's the latest thing. In my day, we didn't have to have an excuse to raise money for charity. We could go just with the spirit of adventure.
Yeah.
Now you seem to be able to have to combine the two, which is a pity.
Tight for purpose.
Ball's Pyramid, this wonderful mountain south of Lord Howe Island. The climbing has been banned for over 25 years. I've just completed a book on Ball's Pyramid, and I'm hoping that's going to be opened up again. No one has climbed the west face of Ball's Pyramid. Wow, it's the highest sea spire in the world. So there's something you could do. Most of the deserts have been crossed. What one have you run across?
I've done the driest, hottest, coldest and windiest. So
Wow.
I did 200, well, I didn't cross the entire thing. I did 250 k's in the Atacama Desert in Chile, the Gobi Desert in China, the Sahara Desert in Egypt and Antarctica.
Right, yeah, well there you are. So to me, I mean, the very fact that you came up with those, the driest half, so there's things like that people can still do. Even if it's just getting with the scouts and going walking, or with the guides, or whatever they call people, Sydney bushwalkers these days, that's well worth it. All of those things are exciting things you can do. Get out. Look, we came from the plains of Africa and as hunter-gatherers, and we're not designed to live like termites in cities, I don't think. And so if you want to really see yourself, I have this beautiful track I walk down each morning, and I'm out with nature and I just love it.
We did a podcast with Dr. Les Higgins, and he talks about a movement he calls biophilia, and it's exactly that. We're not meant to be in cities. We're meant to have a connection with nature, the colours of nature, running water, wind. Right. It affects our mental state, and to be a complete human being and run optimally, we're naive to think that we can ignore.
Isn't that wonderful that you say that? Well, then what's going to happen to our world where we end up with our kids now in Parramatta? They're building a 60-storey high-rise with a school in it. And I say it's like
children.
It's free-range kids compared to battery kids or termites, living like termites. Yeah. And I don't think it's going to be good. And that's because of this mad growth. See, if you're going to fit 100 million or 1 billion into Australia, you're going to end up living like people in Shanghai. And is that sensible? Of course it isn't. One day, as I mentioned to my business friends who all want growth, I said, when we get to 1 trillion people in Sydney, will that be too many? And they have to stop and realise that the logic in what I'm saying is you end up with such huge numbers with exponential growth. So they've said, oh yeah, I agree with you, Dick, we've got to stop growing one day, but they won't admit when. And we should be planning now. You as young people should be out there communicating, we've got to stop that type of growth. We can have growth in quality, growth in efficiencies, growth in removing waste, but just in having more and more people and digging more and more out of the ground, it's not possible.
Yeah. Well, let's get into our final questions. I'm very conscious of everyone's time.
Is it still working, do you think, everything?
Oh, let's hope so, or I'm going to cry.
Right. Is there supposed to be a light on or something?
No, they're all good. Yeah. I'll ask you the question and then I'll go and double check. We already talked about this, but you're an old man and you've lived a fulfilling life. You're sitting on your porch just up there in Terry Hills, and what is it you want to be remembered for?
It's interesting, people say, it's the most common question, what do I want to be remembered for? I don't want to be remembered for anything.
You said that.
When I'm dead, I'm dead. And if I've done a few worthwhile things during my life that are not just for my own benefit, that'll be wonderful. But no, I don't want to be remembered for anything.
Okay. What do you need in life to be completely fulfilled?
What do I need in life to be completely fulfilled? I think important things are a loving relationship. To be well fed and to be warm when you need to be warm, especially on a very cold winter's time, and to be cooler when it's very hot. And they're basically the things. Yeah, really, having a good relationship, but then being well enough fed and being warm and cold whenever it's necessary. They're the things that you need, I think.
Now, before I've got one final question, I did pick you up a little gift. It was inspired by my daughter Layla, green eggs and ham. And just the message in this book reminds me a lot of yourself, to be honest, the way that you've continued persevering and what you've been able to achieve through defying the odds and continuing on. And I must say, Dr. Z's probably writes some of the best business books I've ever read. So,
well, you're very kind. Now, I want to ask you a question. It's interesting, how old are you?
I'm 26.
26 and you're 31? Mm-hmm. Yeah. How come you know anything about Dick Smith? I'm just amazed that as a young person I'm sort of 71, I'm a completely 2 generations apart, that you'd even know about me.
Well, first of all, embarrassingly, I did think before we lined you up for this interview that you did own Dick Smith's electronics.
Right.
But the other thing that really sticks in my mind is some of the interviews that you did on the news where you really spoke the truth and were very upfront. Like my whole family would stop and be like, wow, that's refreshing.
So you'd heard that one on TV or something?
Yeah, and look, there's no specific interview or whatever that I can point to, but one event that I do remember very clearly is that iceberg
Right.
attempt. And I was saying to Sam in the car, I was young at the
But you
time.
weren't even born then.
No, I was around when you were towing the iceberg.
No, you weren't, no, because it was 1976. When were you born?
Was it 1976 you towed the iceberg in? I must have heard about it.
Yeah, that's what it is.
He felt like he lived it.
I
Yeah,
felt like
see, that's what I find
Yeah.
amazing, how young people like you could even know all of these things. You weren't even born when I did them.
And
I get young people who say to me, and I think, how would you even know about
Yeah,
me?
well, I mean, for me, it's definitely the adventure and the philanthropy side.
Right.
That's the space that I'm in.
Yes.
And so I do look for mentors in
Yes.
that kind of space, and who do it from a different type of angle as well.
Right.
So
One of the proudest things that happens to me is that when I owned Dick Smith Electronics, I came up with the Funway books. These were Funway into electronics. And I'll now go, I was giving a talk at the Optus Earth Station, and there's all these engineers with PhDs, and they're looking at me as if I'm sort of the Pope or the King. And I said, why are you looking at me like that? And they learned their electronics from the Funway kits.
That's
And
amazing.
here they are, PhDs, I haven't got no qualifications. And they looked on Dick Smith as the person who got them into this career, whereas I looked on them, gee, you know more than I'd ever know about electronics.
it's not always about formal education.
Is that right?
I've heard we have one of the best car radio installers in Australia in the room. So,
And it's interesting, I give talks to schools and I say, get as many qualifications as you can. Let me say that first of all. I always say that because if I'm a boss going to employ someone, if someone's got a qualification and the other person hasn't, I'll put the person on with a qualification because it shows that they put hard work in.
Yeah.
But then I say to them, but if you can't get the qualifications, don't write yourself off because everyone's good at different things. And I virtually, at the age of 20, I thought I was a failure. And luckily I opened Dick Smith Electronics and found I was good at running a business. And so I wasn't any good academically, but I was good at something. And my story I give to young people is, we're all good at something, but be very careful about persevering at something you're not good at. Because one of the greatest lies is that you can be good at anything. That's not right. Biologically and genetically, some people are artistic, some are mechanical, some are more academic, and you should try and pick what you naturally have an aptitude for, and then work hard at that. And that's an important point.
Yeah, I mean, I had to do an interview about it recently, and I talked about that with law. Like, I always wanted to enter into the not-for-profit space, but got my law degree, A-type personality, worked in a corporate law environment. I was like, I don't really want to be particularly good at this, and I also don't have the patience to become good at it.
Yeah.
And so then I started my running, and I was like, oh, this has actually become a much more powerful vehicle for me to affect what I care about more, so my purpose. And so, and I have much more patience with this endurance sport.
Yeah.
And I found for me, like, the thing that you're willing to become most vulnerable in is the thing that often you're most likely to become successful at.
Yeah.
And so that's how I tied. So my issue is like access to quality education around the world for children, boys and girls, but I often generally focus on females. So I ran across South Africa 2 years ago, across rural South Africa, 2,000 Ks in 32 days, looking at the connection between the inaccessibility of feminine hygiene products and girls dropping out from school.
Right.
And then this year, I'm running across India. It's about a 4,000 kilometre run, 75-day project, and I'm visiting 18 development projects along the route that all look at unique barriers to accessing education, from child marriage to child labour to gender issues, malnutrition, and I'm exploring it all through a digital content program.
Now, do you agree that the key to population is educating women because they have less kids, especially if they have control of their own fertility?
I think the key to most things is access, women being empowered and being educated. For sure.
And that's what we've got to do. It's sad to me, I look at, say, the Philippines, where they've got this enormous population growth because of the Catholic Church not allowing contraception, and then you have Italy, which is the home of the Catholic Church, so presumably most people are Catholic, but the population is decreasing. So they're either not doing it or they're not taking any notice of the Pope. I think probably the second.
I think the second one too.
Yes. But it's just interesting that you look at poor the Philippines, where they're so fundamentally, and so they're having just so many kids, and how can they're going to end up with starvation?
I mean, in India, like, the population is out of control, and it's a really interesting space to work in. I hate that I have to be the one that has to depart because I could chew your ear off
Yeah,
all day.
no, I think
That's
we
right.
finished anyway.
Last question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No, you won't. Thank you.